Crazy Clay Allison once shot a man, stripped down naked, and proceeded to do a war dance over the spot where the man died, with nothing on except for his birthday suit and a smile. Clay didn't know fear. Not necessarily because he was a brave man, but mostly because he was batshit crazy. He's a relatively unknown gunfighter, but he did coin the term Shootist, a term he most definitely lived up to. Join me on this latest crazier than a shithouse rat edition of Bloody Beaver Podcast. Robert Clay Allison was born in Tennessee on September 2nd, 1841. He was the fourth out of 9 children, and as is the case with a lot of these guys I cover, his father would die when Clay was very young. As most young Southern men did during the Civil War, Clay enlisted with the Confederate Army at the age of 21 in October of 1861. Not for long, though. He was medically discharged after about 3 months. His discharge papers list the reason as, quote, emotional or physical excitement that produces paroxysmal of a mixed character, partly epileptic and partly maniacal. The discharge documents further suggested that the condition might have been as the result of a blow received many years ago, producing a depression of the skull. So yeah, in other words, Clay had some brain damage and was crazy as a bedbug. I didn't know what the term paroxysmal meant, so I googled it. I also don't know how to pronounce it, and I'll never, ever be able to pronounce that word. But according to dictionary.com, it's in reference to any sudden, violent outburst or a fit of violent action or emotion. Clay would be able to re-enlist several months later, this time with the 9th Tennessee Cavalry under Nathan Bedford Forrest. Allison would go on to serve with this unit until May of 1865 when the war ended and they were surrendered. Guess his type of crazy was just the right amount of crazy for General Forrest. The common Confederate soldier like Clay Allison was taken prisoner when they surrendered, but were quickly paroled and sent back home. They weren't tried for treason or sent to POW camps or anything like that. In most cases, I believe they were even allowed to keep their firearms. Don't quote me on that part. I'm not 100% sure, but I do believe that's the case. I read one account that says Clay was charged with being a spy and sentenced to be shot to death, but the night before the execution, he killed a guard and escaped. I couldn't find any reliable sources on that, though, so probably though, he was just paroled like every other Confederate soldier. After returning home to Tennessee, Clay became a member of the local KKK. Damn it, Clay! That's what's so frustrating researching these Wild West legends. There's always something like this that pops up. It's like, dang, man, I really wanted to like you. Then you had to go join the damn Ku Klux Klan. As you'll see later on in this episode, Clay Allison did sometimes fight on the side of right. He was a damn lunatic and a killer, but unlike previous guys I've covered like Wes Hardin or Jim Miller, Clay did seem to have somewhat of a moral code. The whole KKK thing, I don't know, it tarnishes things. I looked into the history of the KKK recently and learned some interesting stuff. For instance, it was originally founded to be some sort of a silly fraternal club. Even their name has no real meaning. They were based on the defunct Sons of Malta group, and their initial motivation was, quote, ludicrous initiations, the baffling of public curiosity, and the amusement for members were the only objects of the Klan. Obviously, that didn't last long. They quickly morphed into a secret vigilante group that would target and terrorize freed slaves, as well as any white people who sympathized with the Norther in the war, or even just anybody who sympathized with the former slaves. To what extent Clay was involved with this shit, I don't know. The sources I read said that he was involved in many conflicts during this time. The KKK was opposed to the Freedmen's Bureau of Wayne County, and the Freedmen's Bureau was a government agency whose goal was to direct provisions, clothing, and fuel, as deemed needful, for the immediate and temporary shelter and supply of destitute and suffering refugees and freed slaves and their wives and children. These fucking KKK assholes just couldn't abide that at all. What pieces of shit. These groups like the KKK are so hypocritical. And what really cracks me up is these types call themselves Christians. Jesus was a brown-skinned Arabic Jew, you dumb fucks. He's literally everything you hate. Huh? Bullshit. Not my Jesus. My Jesus had blonde hair and blue eyes, chewed Copenhagen, and enjoyed a nice, cool Miller High Life. So you get out of here with all that damn left-wing commie brown-skinned Jesus shit. So stupid. If you genuinely think someone is lesser than you based on the melanin in their skin, something they can't control, or that you're somehow superior based on the color of your skin, you're a damn fool. And if that offends you, then stop listening to my podcast. Back to the story. Clay Allison probably killed a soldier around this time when they tried to seize his family farm. Much like the claim of him being a spy, I couldn't verify that this is actually true. Either way, he left Tennessee and headed to Texas with 2 of his brothers, his sister, and a brother-in-law. Once in Texas, while crossing a river via ferry, Allison got into a confrontation with the ferry operator. He believed the man charged him a little bit too much money to cross. An argument ensued, causing Clay to beat the man unconscious. Not a lot of self-control with Clay around this time. He eventually signed on as a Callahan with Charlie Goodnight's outfit. You may remember him from episode 5 I did on the real Lonesome Dove. He punched cattle with Charlie Goodnight on the Goodnight Loving Trail through Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado. By 1867, Clay was working as a trail boss for M.L. Dalton. He would also work for such legendary ranchers as Lewis Coleman and Irwin Lacey. So it looks like Clay Allison wasn't too bad at being a cowboy. He must have been good on a horse and a hard worker. Men like Charlie Goodnight and Oliver Loving wouldn't just hire anybody. But still a tad bit on the crazy side. He got a little dust up in Texas over the rights of a watering hole. Legend goes that he and his opponent decided to settle the matter by digging a grave and entering the pit with bowie knives. The loser would be buried in the pit and the winner would gain the rights of the waterhole. Allison was said to have had excellent skills with the bowie knife, and obviously he didn't lose. I mean, he wasn't buried in the pit. But whether or not he actually killed the other man is not known. And that's one of those stories you gotta take with several grains of salt. All these Wild West figures I talk about have a certain amount of legend mixed in with truth, and sometimes it's hard to figure out which is which. In 1870, Clay started his own ranch in Colfax County, New Mexico, not far from the towns of Cimarron and Elizabethtown. And he did get along well with his fellow ranchers. They'd bust ass all week, and come the weekend, they'd head to town and blow off some steam. It's said that Clay would get his load on, then ride up and down the street, shooting out lights and windows and just causing all sorts of drunken mayhem. That fall, a man named Charles Kennedy was arrested and being held in Elizabethtown jail. Kennedy was accused of killing and robbing guests who stayed overnight at his cabin. Clay and some companions broke into the jail, threw a rope around Kennedy's head, and drug him behind a horse until the man was dead. Vigilante justice rears its ugly head once again. Seeing as how Clay was nuttier than a squirrel turd, killing the man just wasn't enough. He then decapitated Kennedy, cut his head off, placed it in a sack, carried it 29 miles to the town of Cimarron, and staked it out in front of an inn. By the way, Kennedy was guilty. Later, when his home was searched, they found the remains of his victims. Not long thereafter, Clay may or may not have been involved in a little bit of mule theft. In 1871, he and 2 others were accused of stealing 12 mules belonging to the Army. A few months later, they did it again, and this time the Army came calling. They were trying to inspect Allison's corrals when a confrontation broke out, and Clay pulled his pistol and accidentally shot himself in the foot. That's always embarrassing. He and his companions got away, but Clay was left with a permanent limp for the rest of his life. All over a piece of ass, man. Once his foot was more or less healed up, Clay decided to go get his drunk on in a local saloon. Clay got mean when he drank. Alcohol and brain injuries just don't mix. First, he got into an argument with a man named Miller. Miller wisely separated himself from the saloon, and still pissed off and drunk, Clay Allison then entered the county clerk's office and threw a knife at John Lee, the clerk. Lee fled in fear of his life as Allison repeated the act to a young lawyer named Melvin Mills. Mills also fled. The town doctor confronted Clay and tried to de-escalate things. He was trying to calm Clay down, at the same time trying to convince the lawyer not to go get a gun and shoot Clay in self-defense. Allison just laughed the whole thing off, saying he didn't really have a problem with the clerk or the lawyer, he was just having fun. What? A guy can't get drunk and start randomly throwing knives at innocent people? What the fuck is this world coming to when a guy can't just throw his extremely sharp knife at someone while under the influence of strong liquor? We're having fun. What? We're just breaking balls. Clay obviously had no fear when it came to men, but he was sort of a scaredy cat when it came to the ladies. He was shy and awkward, didn't really know how to talk to them. Probably kind of freaked him out a little bit. I get that, I'm the same way. I'm pretty sure I set off many a girl's creep alarm when I was a little bit younger. Allison courted a Miss Josephine Bishop in the mid-1870s, but she ended up marrying another man. Same thing happened soon thereafter with a lady named Carrie Gale. She also chose another man over Clay. And I wonder how much of it had to do with his reputation as a killer versus him just being, a little bit crazy. I can see Clay on a date and everything's going good, you get the girl to laugh a little bit, do a little bit of sweet talking. And then Clay would get just a little bit too comfortable, like, hey, did I ever tell you about that time I cut a guy's head off and stuck it on a stick? You should have seen it. His luck would change, though. At the age of 39, he met 18-year-old Dora McCullough. She was an orphan, and her caregivers didn't approve of the relationship, so she ran off to Clay, and they eloped in 1873. The other women noped, but Dora eloped. Right? Okay, moving forward. They say that for every fast man with a gun, there's always someone out there faster. And Clay met that someone shortly after his marriage. Discussing Wild Bill Hickok's quickness on the draw one evening with a guy named Mace Bowen, Clay claimed that he was faster than Wild Bill. Bowen disagreed. He then challenged Allison. Let's wager a gallon of whiskey. Clay agreed. They paced off a distance and both turned around at the same time. Bowen's six-shooter was already pointed at Clay before he even had a chance to draw. Clay was crazy, but he wasn't stupid. He left his pistol in the holster and bought Bowen that gallon of whiskey owed to him. The two then took the whiskey out of town, where Bowen taught Clay the tricks of the trade when it came to fast drawing. Remember that ferryman that Clay had beaten unconscious? Well, that man's nephew came to be somewhat of a gunman himself. And on January 7th, 1874, he came looking to rectify things. The guy's name was Chuck Colbert. and he was already reported to have killed 6 men. And he was bragging that Clay Allison would be his 7th, revenge for him beating his uncle. But instead of challenging Clay head-on, Chuck took a different approach. He befriended Allison, spent a whole day drinking and gambling with the man, and then invited him to dinner, just waiting for the right opportunity to kill the man and avenge his family name. Once they finished eating, Colbert suddenly reached for his pistol, but Clay had been anticipating such an occurrence. Like I said, he was crazy, not stupid. Chuck's gun nicked the table when he tried to level it, causing the shot to go wild. This allowed Clay ample time to pull his pistol and put a bullet in the man's head. Later on, Allison would be asked, "Why did you accept to have a meal with a guy that clearly meant to kill you?" His answer was, quote, "Because I didn't want to send a man to hell on an empty stomach." Chuck Colbert was buried in an unmarked grave, presumably with a full tummy. Allison would then go on to get mixed up in a little something known as the Colfax County War. There was this guy, Lucian B. Maxwell, who was in charge of a huge land grant that included the towns of Cimarron and Elizabethtown that we already mentioned, as well as several others. In 1870, he sold the land grant to some English investors who then decided to try to remove all of the squatters, many of whom who had been living on the land with their families for years and years. They had ranches and homesteads, basically, from what I understand, all under an unwritten agreement with Maxwell. And now they were all getting evicted. All that time spent building their homes just to have the rug get pulled out from underneath them. Many left, but some stayed and fought back, including Clay Allison and a minister by the name of F.J. Tolby. The leaders behind the grant were known as the Santa Fe Ring. If that sounds familiar, you probably remember the name from Young Guns too. Those were the powerful Santa Fe politicians and businessmen who hired Pat Garrett to kill Billy the Kid. And it looks like now they were going to get into the real estate business. Once authorities started serving eviction notices in Colfax County, that's when things started popping off. Law officers were shot at, fires were started, rustling and other crimes increased. The land grant members organized night raids on homesteaders that wouldn't move. This led to the homesteaders to form their own group known as the Colfax County Ring, which some claimed was led by our very own Clay Allison. Reverend Tolby sided with the homesteaders and was very adamant about doing whatever he could to stop the land grant owners. And it wasn't too long before the good minister was found dead, shot in the back. Now, it's important to note originally Clay had done a little bit of work for the Santa Fe Ring, but not after they killed the Reverend. He then switched sides and fought on behalf of the settlers. Rumor had it that a local constable named Cruz Vega was the one who killed Tolby. Clay Allison led a masked mob into town and confronted Vega. He denied having any part and laid the blame on his uncle, a guy by the name of Francisco Grego. The mob didn't care much about what he had to say, though. They had already made their minds up and wasted no time in hanging Vega to death off of a telegraph pole. The next day, when Vega's uncle Grego retrieved the body, he was told by Clay that he wouldn't be allowed to bury his nephew in town. Not in the same graveyard that the minister was buried in. Clay wouldn't fucking have it. He wouldn't even let the man bury his nephew outside of the cemetery. He didn't want his body anywhere inside city limits. And Francisco Grego had had enough. You can only push a man so far. Later on that day, he and another man named Florencio Donahue started making threats. They found Clay Allison in a Cimarron saloon and started accusing him of hanging Vega. Things escalated and Grego tried to distract Clay with his hat while at the same time pulling his revolver. The old fan in the hat trick. But Clay saw it coming and put 2 bullets in the man, killing him where he dropped. Then Crazy Clay just sort of, went crazy. He and his compadres ran roughshod over the town for a few days, drinking, shooting out lights, causing all sorts of trouble. At one point, Clay stripped down naked. I shit you not, I'm not making this up. He stripped down naked, tied a red ribbon around his dick, and then did a naked war dance over the spot where he killed Grego. Clay was arrested for the killing, but the charges ended up getting dropped after it was ruled a justifiable homicide. What wasn't a justifiable homicide back in those days? There's a lot more to the Colfax County War that you can read about online. It was no joke. There were upwards of 200 people killed during the conflict. Another action involving Clay took place in January of 1876. Clay and a couple other guys, pissed off about a newspaper article accusing Clay of leading local mob violence, broke into the news office and set off a charge of black powder, but not before he threw the printing press into the Cimarron River. By this time, Clay had a big target on his back. Even the governor of New Mexico was pissed at him, publicly stating that he wanted Allison out of New Mexico altogether. Clay wasn't a pussy, I'll give him that. Definitely wasn't afraid of a little confrontation. That's evident when Governor Axtell passed through Cimarron in a stagecoach that summer. Allison climbed aboard the stagecoach, made himself at home, and rode with the governor all the way to Colorado. He asked him what kind of a man he was to be so interested in his personal freedom. Basically, how dare you, sir? Axtell countered by asking why Clay Allison just didn't surrender himself on bail and face the judgment like a man. Clay replied by giving the governor a rock with a post-it note that said "suck it" taped to it. No, I'm just kidding about that part. He did reply and said if he could get a fair trial, he would, but he would never submit to a real trial in Taos County by greasers. His words, not mine. Evidently, Cimarron, New Mexico had a pretty large Hispanic population. The governor responded that he would demand a fair trial for Allison, and later, Allison did turn himself in. And since it was the Wild West, he was acquitted and released as a free man. He then turned his life around, donated his guns to charity, started seeing a therapist, spent time volunteering at youth shelters, and, lived a long, peaceful life. And I think you all know that was bullshit. Clay decided to celebrate his newfound freedom. He and his brother, both drunk, found a party going on in a nearby saloon. And they crashed it. Bunch of party poopers. Started forcing unwilling participants to dance with them. The law was sent for. Town Marshal Charles Faber came to investigate. The first thing he did was attempt to disarm the Allison brothers. They ignored his request, so he left and came back with 2 deputies. When the lawmen entered the saloon again, someone shouted, "Look out!" Clay's brother John reached for his gun and Faber shot him. Clay responded by firing 4 shots at Faber, one of which proved to be fatal. John Allison had already been shot in the chest and arm and was shot yet again as Faber's gun discharged when he fell. The 2 other deputies decided they had enough and ran out of the dance hall. Clay attempted pursuit, but the men got away. Clay then went back into the saloon, grabbed Marshal Faber's body, and drug it over to his wounded brother, telling him to look at the son of a bitch that shot him and everything was going to be all right. What the fuck? Of course they were arrested, and of course they were acquitted. Between this podcast and my last one, if you're doing a drinking game and taking a shot every time I say the word acquitted, I would seriously consider seeing a doctor. You've probably got acute alcohol poisoning at this point. By the way, Clay's brother John would recover from his wounds. In March of 1877, Clay sold his ranch and moved to Kansas, where he dabbled as a cattle broker. The interesting thing about some of these Wild West characters is who was famous in their time and who wasn't. Nowadays, we know all about Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday, but those guys were relatively unknown in their time. It wasn't until after their deaths that they became household names. Clay Allison, on the other hand, was well known while he was still alive. His reputation preceded him wherever he went, to the point that local newspapers would note when he visited their towns. And additionally, the Kinsley Graphic paper wrote about him in December of 1878. Quote, "His appearance is striking, tall, straight as an arrow, dark complexion, carries himself with ease and grace. Gentlemanly and courteous in manner, never betraying by word or action the history of his eventful life." It wasn't long before he headed to the infamous cowtown Dodge City, Kansas. A common practice in those rough towns was to prohibit the carrying of firearms within city limits. A common practice of gunmen like Clay was to completely ignore such ordinances. And I don't blame him. He had a reputation. Surely he had a lot of people gunning for him. Don't call me Shirley. Or, there were up-and-comers that wanted to establish their own reputations by taking him out. Why would he want to leave himself completely defenseless? Also, it's kind of like that great song Poncho and Lefty. Just like Poncho, Clay was the type to wear his guns outside his pants for all the honest world to feel. This is who I am, take it or leave it. So, one version of Clay's visit to Dodge City states that he and his buddies basically terrorized the town. They went on a drunken spree, and this caused deputies Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson to flee in fear of their lives. Another version is that Earp and Masterson confronted Allison and convinced him to get the hell out of town. The third version, the one that probably is closest to the truth, is that Allison had no contact with Earp or Masterson and was persuaded to leave town by a local bartender. Basically, hey man, get out while the getting's good. You had your fun here, no need to take things further. Clay and his men came to town looking for trouble. While they were busy filling themselves with all that liquid courage, Wyatt Earp was assembling his own men and preparing to react. Clay eventually left town on his own accord before shit kicked off. That would have been an interesting confrontation, though. After leaving Kansas, Clay moved to Hemphill County, Texas, and started a ranch. A local newspaper ran the following article on October 31st, 1878. "We learned from a correspondent in Texas that R.C. Allison has been the hero of a brilliant encounter with Indians. The scene of the fight was somewhere near Fort Elliott. Allison and a number of ranchmen were there with a company of soldiers as volunteers. When they came inside of the Indians, they found that the Red Devils had surrounded the house of an American settler and were about to massacre the family. The officer commanding the troops, thinking there was an ambush laid for his party, refused to attack. Allison, with his usual courage and daring, asked permission to lead 25 soldiers to the rescue. This was refused, and he then called for volunteers from the ranchmen. 14 responded to his call and, with Allison in the head, charged the Indians. They succeeded after a hot engagement in which they had one man killed in rescuing the family. Allison, though his horse was shot, escaped any injury. It was a heroic affair and reflects great credit upon the gallant man who led the charge." And this is what makes Clay Allison so interesting to me. The dude wasn't an outlaw. Sure, he probably stole some mules at some point, but hell, who didn't? He was a husband, a father, a working man. He also enjoyed his liquor a little bit too much, probably enjoyed killing a little bit too much, and he was for sure suffering from some sort of brain trauma. But he wasn't a coward. Nowadays we're barely scraping the surface of what we know about head trauma. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy, another word I can't pronounce, also known as CTE, is a neurodegenerative disease caused by repeated head injuries. You see a lot of pro athletes, MMA fighters, as well as military veterans with this. It causes all sorts of erratic behaviors. For sure, some of Clay Allison's actions were affected by this. You don't strip down naked, tie a ribbon around your dick, and do a happy dance over the spot you killed a man unless you've got a few screws loose. It also probably made him more reckless. I mentioned before, Clay didn't appear to fear anything, and a man that's not afraid could be a very deadly opponent. That same brain damage that caused him to get kicked out of the army and cut a man's head off probably also gave him the courage to lead that attack and save that family. But let's talk more about his crazy antics, because that's more fun. One time in Texas, Clay was reported to have stripped butt-ass naked, again, wearing only his gun belt, and rode up and down the streets of Mobeetie. The ladies of Mobeetie, Texas were horrified by such an action and called the local law enforcement, who demanded that Clay dismount. He did, and he also pulled his pistol. He then marched the sheriff to the saloon at gunpoint and forced the man to drink until he could no longer stand up. The entire time while butt-ass naked. Clay just didn't give a fuck. Full disclosure, I do record every single one of these podcasts completely naked, except for a pair of rawhide chaps that I made myself and spurs. Don't judge me. Moving forward. Once in the summer of 1886, Clay had just finished a long, hard cattle drive all the way to Cheyenne, Wyoming, and he had a terrible toothache. A few years back, I had an infected wisdom tooth, and it's probably one of the worst pains I've ever felt in my entire life. It's like you feel every throb in every limb and extremity of your body. When the dentist pulled that tooth, it was almost an orgasmic feeling that swept over my body. Instant relief. But then again, I was also under the effects of laughing gas, and I was prescribed a delicious cocktail of painkillers and antibiotics. Clay Allison would have no such luxuries. He sought out a dentist, but the nervous man pulled the wrong tooth. So he found another dentist who pulled the right tooth, and then he returned to the original dentist seeking revenge. We've all heard of an eye for an eye. Clay wanted a tooth for a tooth. He held the dentist down, grabbed some forceps, and pulled out one of the man's molars. And then he went back for more. This time he wasn't very careful, and the pliers not only grabbed the man's tooth, but also part of his lip. And Clay was just yanking. Some locals heard the screams of pain and came to the man's aid, pulling Clay off of him before he could do more damage. Now I know nobody likes a dentist, but that seems a little excessive. Around this time, Clay and his family would move back and forth between Texas and New Mexico, finally settling in Pecos, Texas by the late 1880s. And it was here that Clay would finally meet his demise. Did he meet a desperado that was faster on the draw than him? Was he the victim of a revenge ambush? Did he get strung up by a lynch mob like those that he had once led? Nope. Clay was hauling a load of supplies to his ranch when a sack of grain fell from the wagon. Trying to halt its fall, Clay fell from the heavily loaded wagon, and in the very next instant, the wagon wheels rolled over across him, breaking his neck. As the horses reared and lurched forward, his neck was further crushed by the heavy buckboard, almost decapitating him. He was 47 years old and left behind a pregnant wife. Was Clay Allison a gentleman gunfighter like many people claim, or a villain and a cold-blooded killer? Like most of history, nothing is black and white, but mostly various shades of gray. And Clay lived life deep in that gray. He did things his own way. Sometimes he fought on the side of right. Sometimes he fought on the side of wrong. He liked to have a little bit too much fun sometimes. But some accounts I read did claim that he straightened up his life in his last few years, stopped drinking, and became the ideal family man. He's buried in Pecos County at the west of the Pecos Museum. His tombstone reads, Robert Clay Allison, 1840 to 1887. He never killed a man that didn't need killing. And that's about all I know about Clay Allison. This episode was originally going to be on the great mountain man Jim Bridger, but that's still a work in progress. I need to do a little bit more reading and research. That's probably going to be a long one. During the holidays, I did do some behind-the-scenes podcast stuff. I switched RSS hosts and set up bloodybeaver.com. So, I actually have a website now. Nothing fancy at all, just bare bones. But you can listen to all my episodes on there, as well as contacting me on there if you want to send a message. Not sure what else I'm going to do with it, but it does have a blog feature, so maybe in the future, if I want to write anything or post pictures about some of these people we're talking about, I can do so. So yeah, that's bloodybeaver.com. Also got my Patreon account up and running. In the next few days, I'm planning on adding a members-only episode on Patreon. So basically, for $5 a month, you get access to exclusive content. All the stuff I've already recorded is still going to remain out there and free, and I'm still going to be putting out episodes just like I'm doing right now. But about every couple of weeks or so, I'm going to put a little episode on Patreon as well. So if you want to, check that out. No idea if there's even a demand for it, so if it doesn't take off, I'll just go ahead and release all those exclusive episodes on here for free. But Daddy is trying to buy a new laptop, y'all. I don't really have many other updates. Dan the Man Buck sent me an interesting article he wrote for the Wild West History Association Journal. That's a mouthful. Talking about facial recognition technology and the abundance of fake pictures being circulated out there. Evidently, there's a huge market for finding old pictures at garage sales and claiming that they're famous outlaws and selling them on eBay. Just do a Google image search for Billy the Kid. The one of him standing with that rifle and looking like he hit every branch falling out of the ugly tree is the only verified Billy the Kid picture out there. The one with him playing poker or croquet or whatever that game's called, none of those are actually verified. It's all just speculation. Kind of makes me want to find some old pictures and put them up for auction. Get my skin in the game, daddy-o. So yeah, that's all I got. Hope y'all all enjoyed this episode. Feel free to hit me up at bloodybeaver.com or bloodybeaverpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for all the reviews and likes. Please subscribe to me on wherever you listen to your podcast. You can still find my content on YouTube as well. And don't be like Clay Allison and strip down naked and tie a damn red ribbon around your manhood and pull out a dentist's tooth against his will. Or do it. What the fuck am I to tell you how to live?